Hello, I'm Stephanie Rhodes. I'm going to be talking to you about a moment in American history called the American Renaissance. The decades before the Civil War saw a number of American literary masterpieces. There was a shift in art, focusing more on the American landscape and nature. We see many pictures of the Hudson River Valley, and many art scenes of the American West. And during that time, we also see a shift in literature. Before this time, writers were focused on the Puritan way of life, on their religious experiences, and recording the law and the letters and the happenings of what was going on in their time period. But what we see during the American Renaissance is a shift in that, in a time where literary agents and writers were calling for a movement that would develop a unique American literary style. And it would be quite different from what we're seeing in England. This shift away from the traditional European writings and religious writings segued into what we know as the Romanticism period, and also the Transcendentalism period. Now, these thoughts are more Eastern in their religious thinkings. They're more philosophical. They have to do more with the self and intrinsic value and self-reliance, as we'll see with Ralph Waldo Emerson. When we talk about the American literary Renaissance, we really need to look at Romanticism. And the Romantic movement in America was widely popular, and it was influenced by American writers such as James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Bryant, and their stories focused more on the experience that the reader has. There were more feelings expressed and the emotions that the protagonist goes through, especially when it comes to trepidation and fear and loneliness. Those feelings are exemplified in many of the writings of Irving and Poe. Also, what we see during that Romanticism era is an awareness of the beauty of nature and a preoccupation with freedom, which became a huge source of motivation for those writers. They were delighted in this freedom of expression and emotion, and they really played on the changing landscape of America at the time. The writers of the Romanticism era inspired what would then become this Emersonian movement of Transcendentalism. And Transcendentalist writers were drawn to this concept as they started to express their ideas through poems, essays, articles. This was a time when the printing of American works was starting to become widely circulated. And Ralph Waldo Emerson emerged as a leading figure and really the father of this new transcendentalist movement after he published in 1836 his essay entitled Nature. Emerson's ideas struck a chord with a group of upcoming writers who were dissatisfied with mainstream American life. They were tiring of the religious expectations of the time and were looking for greater spiritual meaning. Their focus was on individualism, and they looked to Emerson to guide them into this new thought of Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism has been called a revolution in human consciousness. It was a criticism of old religious attitudes, and it was really looking for social reform. It was inspired by a relationship with nature and empowerment of the individual. Their values were simple living, frugality, a harmony with nature, and the sacredness of life, and the belief that God was in everything, and that the human spirit was the embodiment of God. And what we'll often see in the themes is intuition, consciousness, a self-awareness, divine inspiration, especially through nature. And we'll often see a national identity with this movement away from British literature and into making a true American literature. Ralph Waldo Emerson was an American essayist, lecturer. He was a philosopher, a poet, and he is regarded as the father of Transcendentalism. He really pushed the movement forward with his essay in 1836 entitled Nature. And then following that, he gave a speech called The American Scholar in 1837. And both of these are really the springboard for which other writers were recruited into this transcendentalist movement. Ralph Waldo Emerson was born in Boston, Massachusetts on May 25th, 1803. He was the son of a pastor, and he lost his father at a young age, and he went into Harvard. He graduated from Harvard, and he taught for a little while until he lost his first wife from tuberculosis. And then this is when his change in beliefs really took off. He became a ordained minister in the Unitarian Church, but he really had a problem with the oppression and some of the more strict religious philosophies. Emerson called the priesthood and his ministry an antiquated profession and decided to leave the church. In 1833, he toured Europe, and that is where his philosophies really started to change, and he became inspired in Paris by the nature around him. And he went on to tour England, and when he returned to the United States, he had this new vision of what he saw in his writing and his beliefs, which focused more on nature and the freedom of individualism and individualistic expression of those beliefs. In 1840, Emerson, together with other like-minded academics, formed a transcendentalist group and began to publish a journal called The Dial. After that, he published his second book entitled Essays, which included his most famous essay, Self-Reliance. In 1844, he went on to publish a second collection of essays, which included The Poet, Experience, Gifts, These are all of his more popular writings. He also made his living as a lecturer and teacher. After this, his writing and his philosophy really started to focus and reflect his Indian philosophy and his Eastern religious beliefs. Emerson's work not only influenced other writers such as Henry Thoreau, but Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne as well. All of these writers together pushed this American Renaissance and this new American literature into the 20th century. Henry David Thoreau was an abolitionist, a historian, a poet, a teacher, and he was heavily influenced by Emerson and his works. Thoreau was born in Concord, Massachusetts in 1817. He's best known for his book Walden, which was inspired by a 2-year experiment on simple living, which he started on July 4th, 1845, when he moved into a small cabin that he had built on land that was owned by Emerson. And he spent this time in the forest and in the nature in Walden Pond, and took those experiences and turned it into this wonderful writing in the book Walden. One of Thoreau's biggest contributions to the literary world were his essays advocating the abolition of slavery. His essay, Plea for Captain John Brown, is one of the most predominant essays that he wrote immediately following the raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859. Thoreau was able to use rhetoric to assuage public opinion to support John Brown and his actions, and he composed speeches that went along with his essay in support of the abolitionist movement. After suffering for 20 years from tuberculosis, he spent his last years revising and editing his unpublished works like The Maine Woods and Excursion, and he died at the young age of 44 from tuberculosis. One of Emerson and Thoreau's understudies was Louisa May Alcott. Although she was never formally educated, she spent a lot of time with Emerson and Thoreau. She was a transcendentalist by birth. Her parents were both transcendentalists and taught her those same values. And she continued those values through her life and in her writing. She was born November 29th, 1832 in Germantown, Pennsylvania. At the age of 30, she became a nurse during the Civil War, and these actions during the war inspired her to write hospital sketches, which was her first writing. Louisa May Alcott wrote under several pen names before she felt confident enough to make a career from her writing. She fought in the women's suffrage movement and was the first woman registered to vote in Concord, Massachusetts. Her most famous work is Little Women, where she created strong female characters. She gave her readers strong, educated female heroines. And this had not been done before in the 19th century. Uncle Tom's Cabin was widely circulated and had a huge success, but for a female writer to write from a female point of view had not been done. And the success of Little Women led her to go on to write Little Men, Joe's Boys, Eight Cousins, An Old-Fashioned Girl. These books personified the nature of women and really put this female character to the forefront and laid a foundation for other women authors to come after her. Francis Matheson created a canon for early American literature in his 1941 publication, American Renaissance, Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman. He gives credit to Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Herman Melville for setting the stage for a true and distinctive American literature. He did not, however, include African American writers or female writers of the 19th century. Critics have said this is flawed and have gone on to add writers such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Margaret Fuller, Louisa May Alcott, and Emily Dickinson. These men and women contributed poetry, rhetoric, narratives, and novels using Emerson's idealism or Transcendentalism. They relied on a simpler form of prose rather than the heavy linguistics formerly seen in English writing. They made the reader feel the story with their use of imagery and emotion. The idea of an American Renaissance has been so influential in part because the literature of this period truly was crucial to the development of American literary traditions, at once building on writings that had preceded it and pointing to future possibilities. Thank you for listening.